Part 1: The Kitchen Table. You grew up in a house where money was never discussed, not because it did not matter, but because it mattered too much. Gary, Indiana, 2001. Your father drove a forklift at a steel distribution center. He worked the day shift because the night shift paid more, and he had asked to transfer 3 times, but each time he lost out to people with more seniority. Your mother worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic where she could not even afford to be a patient herself. What she brought home were a few sample toothbrushes. You shared a room with your younger sister until you were 13. The wall next to the kitchen was so thin that every Friday night, you could clearly hear your parents sorting bills into piles. Which bills had to be paid first? Which ones could wait? Which ones they had to pretend they had not seen? You were not poor in a way other people could easily notice. Not hungry. Not homeless. Just slightly worn-out shoes, an almost right jacket, and a perfectly timed smile so nobody would look too closely. At school, you were smart in a way that made adults pay attention. Mr. Beaumont, your economics teacher, said you asked questions that did not sound like someone your age. He meant it as a compliment. You heard it as a measurement of distance, how far you had already gone, and how much farther you might still be able to go. You read about business the way other people read about sports. Not for inspiration, but for mechanics. Where money went. Where profit disappeared. Why the same product could cost 3 times more simply because it passed through a different seller. When you were 16, you watched your father get passed over for a management position he had effectively been doing for 2 years. The company hired someone from the outside. That night, he said nothing. Your mother asked if anyone wanted more rice. You watched your father reach for the bowl and understood something far too heavy for a child. This system had never been built for people like him. Right there, at that table, you decided you would study the system deeply enough to one day build one of your own. Part 2: The Man Who Opened the Door. His name was Calvin Marsh. 31 years old, with a net worth of $22 million. He came to speak at your school only because his nephew studied there. Almost the entire auditorium was drifting off. You were taking notes. After the talk, you followed him out to the parking lot. He was unlocking a car that cost more than everything in your house combined. You asked, what part of your speech was actually true? He stopped. What part do you think was not true? The part about passion. Nobody builds anything serious on passion alone. Passion is what people talk about when they do not want to explain the real reason. Calvin stayed silent for a few seconds, then sent you a folder of raw market data. If you can find what is missing by Sunday, message me. By Saturday morning, you had found 4 gaps. 11 minutes later, he called you back. For the next 18 months, you worked as Calvin's unpaid research assistant. Maybe it was exploitation. But for a kid who could not afford an expensive education, it was the best business school available. You worked weekends. Built financial models nobody asked for. Learned how to see a business as a system, where money leaked, where things were fragile, and where the real leverage was hiding. In that office, you met Teresa, the head of operations. She taught you that a business was not a beautiful idea. It was a network of dependencies. Which part broke first? Which part looked important but actually was not? And why beginners usually looked in the wrong place? You still went to college, business and computer science. Classes during the day, work at night, 5 hours of sleep, living in the distance between the person you were and the person you wanted to become. You watched other people have weekends, love, and evenings that did not require calculating opportunity cost. You were not jealous. You just understood that you were choosing. And what you were giving up was a normal life you might not even clearly remember later. At 20, sacrifice still looked like strategy. Part 3: The Execution. At 21, you had an idea. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of startup people present on a stage. You discovered that mid-sized logistics companies were losing 15 to 20% of their profit margins because their last-mile delivery contracts were too fragmented. You built software that standardized contracts, automatically reminded companies to renegotiate, compared costs, and captured the money that was leaking out. You had a prototype after 8 months of working nights in a shared apartment. Calvin offered to invest $150,000 for 35%. You said no. It was the first time you had ever turned him down. 35% was too much. You had already calculated dilution across future funding rounds. If you gave up too much at the beginning, by Series B, you would no longer control the thing you were building. Calvin looked at you and smiled. Not warmly, but with respect. You are going to need more than $150,000. I know. You graduated on Saturday. Started the company on Monday. Called your father from the parking lot. He stayed silent for a long time, then said, "Good." One word, but it held every time he had been passed over. You raised $1.8 million and gave up 14%. It took you 7 months before the product truly worked well enough to charge for. When you set the price, you priced it high. A high price said you were not begging the market. The next quarter, contracts surged. Series A is Series B. Every funding round was a test of how badly you needed money. You learned that the best time to raise capital is when you do not actually need it. The system always rewards the people who already have enough. At 24, the company had 180 employees. At 25, 480. You stopped remembering everyone's names, and that bothered you. Then the acquisition offer came, $2.9 billion. You agreed. At 26, the money entered your account on a Thursday afternoon. You stared at the number on your phone for 40 seconds, then placed it face down on the kitchen counter. Outside the window, the city looked completely normal. Nobody knew what had just happened. Part for other hum. You thought you would feel something. Relief. Completion. A full breath after years of running from that kitchen table in Gary. But there was nothing. Only a low hum, like a television left on in the next room. You bought your parents a house. Your father walked through every room, touching the walls as if making sure it was real. Your mother stood in the kitchen and cried. That was the only moment in the entire year that carried emotion worthy of the number. Everything else was lawyers, board meetings, assistants, media, and security procedures. Your life became something managed. On Thanksgiving, your sister picked you up in her 2011 Hyundai. She taught middle school, lived simply, and seemed genuinely okay. On the way home, she played an old song and sang it off-beat, off-key, without the slightest embarrassment. You realized you could not remember the last time you had done something without an audience. Every conversation was positioning. Every dinner was relationship maintenance. Every minute was a resource. You did not sing along. You had forgotten the words. 14 months after the deal, the parent company appointed a professional chief executive officer. You were moved into the role of chief strategy officer. The title meant they would put you in front of investors to tell the founder story in a more appealing way. You watched the product change. Features were cut. Prices were adjusted in ways that hurt the very customers you once wanted to serve. The culture was repackaged into corporate language. What you lost was not only control. You knew you would lose that. What you lost was the feeling of watching something slowly become exactly what it was supposed to be. You resigned on a Wednesday. Not poorer. Not defeated. Just turned into someone no longer necessary inside the very thing you had created. Part 5, The Machine. You tried to stop. 3 months in Nashville. A beautiful house. Money you did not have to touch. Mornings with no meetings. Days when nobody was waiting for your decision. You walked. You read. You had dinner with people who had nothing to do with capital, products, or markets. And you felt uneasy. Because the hunger inside you did not know what to do with comfort. It was born at that kitchen table in Gary. In the sound of bills. In your father's face when the management job went to someone else. That hunger had originally existed to solve a problem. Now the problem was solved. Your parents had a house. They had retirement money. Your father no longer had to take shifts he did not want. But hunger does not check account balances. It just keeps running. 6 months after resigning, you started a new company. A new city, a new problem. This time, you were smarter, colder, cleaner. The seed round closed in 9 days. At the first all-hands meeting, 43 people looked at you. And you heard that hum again. You were 28. You had done this twice. You knew you would do it again. In a board meeting, when you were supposed to be listening to a report, you found yourself thinking about your father standing by the sink, pressing ice against his back after a long shift. You had given him everything he had once lacked. But you could not remember the last time you felt like you had enough. The thing that made you exceptional was also the thing that made every destination feel empty. The refusal to stop. The hunger that outlived the poverty that created it. The wound did not close when the money arrived. The wound was the engine. Close it, and you would stop.